All right, what's going on, everybody? It is Tannen, your SI here, with a little workshop on how to write a good thesis. Because it's not hard to write a thesis, but it's hard to write a good one. So, first off, what is a thesis? For argumentative papers, because the term thesis can kind of change depending on the context, but for an argumentative paper, which is what you're writing, a thesis is a claim or opinion that needs to be argued and supported using evidence from the readings that are given. So it answers a specific question. Without a question, you can't really write a thesis. It is built up of three elements that relate to one another, and it is typically one or two sentences long. Keep in mind that relating or that relation, that's important. So you don't want to list your elements, right? So for the question, which is more useful to the world, pens or pencils? Why? Pens are better than pencils because they are permanent. They let us finalize paperwork, and they are prettier. This is technically a thesis, right? Because it has that initial claim, pens are better than pencils. That's an opinion. And it has three supporting elements. But it's a bad thesis because the reasons listed are just floating in space. They don't relate to one another, and they don't try to work together to create a more developed and substantiated thesis. They're just kind of there. So a much better thesis would be pens are better than pencils because they are permanent, which lets us use them for documentation purposes. This results in less forgeable paperwork, creating secure and reputable institutions within society. So the highlighted sections are my three elements. I started with that same initial claim, right? Pens are better than pencils, but my elements, rather than floating in space, work in tandem with one another. You need the context of the first two elements to even understand the last one and why it's important. So this is much, much better than just listing things that don't really relate to one another. So moving on to, the actual question for this class, because that was a pretty simple question and we didn't actually have any readings that we had to pull from. So what about the question, what is the relationship between what goes on inside of our heads, for example, imagination, memory, fears, dreams, etc., and what goes on in the world? So this is a little bit different because you're not answering a simple yes or no question or choosing a side from two predetermined things, i.e. pens or pencils, right? You're answering what is the relationship between the outside world and our mind/inner world. So your thesis can go a number of directions, and it's up to you to kind of choose a direction and argue that side. So you need to think of a stance that you could argue with the readings that were given. Your claim must be able to be argued against. If you just say the outside world has an effect on our minds, we already know that. The question is asking how that relationship manifests, right? So for example, this is an example thesis. Please do not copy this. Professor Solinger knows that I wrote this. It will not go well for you. But it says, it seems our mind is limited by what is going on in the world around us. We create a world of our own. We create a world of our own that is sectioned off from the world at large. This smaller world is influenced by our nearby surroundings, which are often not compatible with us as people. This leaves us feeling limited by the world itself. So that's the thesis, right? So it's clear what I'm arguing with that initial claim. Our mind is limited by what is going on in the world around us. So this means that somebody could easily argue against that and say, no, our minds are actually expanded by what's going on in the world around us. And that's good. That means we have a stance again. So in this thesis, to be honest, I would probably like to argue the other side. Like personally, I would believe, or I do believe, that the outside world builds up and fortifies our mind rather than limits them. However, when I read the readings that were given and that you have available, I found it easier to argue against that and kind of argue for the other side. And this is fine. If it's easier to write a paper that you might lie, where you might lie and you might argue an opinion that you don't actually believe in, that's totally okay. And it might just make the paper easier to write. If I still wanted to insert a bit of my own true opinion into this paper, it's likely, like if I was actually to write this paper for this class, it's likely I would leave off in the conclusion and say something like, even though the larger world may limit what is going on in the smaller world of our minds, perhaps in time we can change how this dynamic works, right? So I'm still claiming that the outside world limits our minds because maybe that is true or that is true, but I'm leaving it off with saying, oh, but maybe we can change this dynamic. Like maybe that's not a good thing, right? So something that can tell the reader that this is how things are now, but maybe that can change. And yeah, insert some of my actual opinion, like what I do truly believe in, without detracting from the thesis that I'm arguing, right? So yeah, some final tips. Stay away from tentative language. I believe perhaps sometimes this sort of language, it makes your point sound timid and weakens it. So you want to be bold. Our mind is limited by what is going on in the world around us, rather than saying maybe our mind is limited, right? Make sure your thesis can be argued against, right? So go back, read your thesis, and if you can think of things that somebody could argue or, counter argue against it, that means you've chosen a side and you can keep going. But if you can't, then you're probably not actually arguing a side and you need to workshop your thesis a little bit more. And again, it's okay to argue a side that you don't actually believe in. It seems a little unnatural at first, perhaps, but if it makes it easier to write the paper, then maybe go that route. And last but not least, a good thesis takes time. The one that I wrote for Pens maybe took me like 10 minutes to come up with, and the one for Professor Solinger's prompt took me maybe 25 minutes. Finding the right language, specifically that transitional language, showing how one point relates to one another, is what is super tricky, but is also very important because, your thesis is the crux of your paper, so you want that to be good. And personally, some final tips. When brainstorming, I like to make a bubble map. So this was a bubble map for a paper for English 101 in last semester for my English 101. And my claim is that what is normal can be broadened, right? So somebody could say what is normal cannot be broadened, right? So people could argue against that. So that's my initial claim. And then I kind of like make these different ideas and I bounce them off, and whichever thread has like the most sound logic to me is what I go with. So some people might write their intro and body paragraphs first. You might write the bulk of your paper and then go back and inject your thesis and evidence into what you've already written. You don't have to write your thesis before you write the rest of your paper, though that's how I personally do it and think it's like a good practice because it sets you up for your body paragraphs. But writing is personal and you should just try to develop a system that works well for you. So yeah, if you're still having problems, you can contact me at tanarso@gmail.com, or you can come see me for my virtual office hours. The times and link are in the Zoom link are in my tab on Blackboard. With that said, good luck, and if you haven't started writing your paper yet, I would get to writing.